Silent Hill 2 was a genre-defining moment for horror games, and in my humble opinion, it's unlikely to be surpassed in its ability to convey a truly surreal world and the way in which it tackles difficult subject matter. Having received a letter from his presumed dead wife from Silent Hill, James, the protagonist, travels to the titular town to discover more about the origins of this letter. We eventually discover that Silent Hill represents the deteriorating mental state of James and his ongoing battle to overcome depression and guilt due to the passing of his wife. Aside from creatures hiding in the dense fog, the town is mostly deserted. Few characters exist, but of those that you do meet, all are battling their own demons much in the same way James is. Complex, unsettling and disturbing. Not just a survival horror game then, but one that taps into the human psyche, a bold take on the fragility of our existence and the existential fear we all have in common with one another. Let's take a look at some key influences that had a direct impact on the design and development of Silent Hill 2 and ponder if we'll ever come close to another game that takes significant steps forward in addressing difficult topics directly and symbolically.
I'm not your Mary.
Horror comes in many forms for many people, but to me, the most effective horror I've engaged with comes from within the mind. As a teenager, I spent a lot of time watching the Kase Miike movies, such as Audition, Visitor Q, and The Happiness of the Katakouris. And while watching an interview with the always eclectic Miike, to paraphrase him, he determined his own real fears were never based on monsters hiding in the dark or spiritual beings that haunt your home, but what humans are capable of, and capable of doing to one another. My admiration for Miike's work coincided with the release of Silent Hill 2, a game that's themes are very much juxtaposed with Miike's ethos of fear from within. And yes, while Silent Hill 2 does contain an abundance of demonic creatures, it's important to remember these creatures are physical manifestations of James's deep-rooted, latent fears and guilt. What Silent Hill 2 does so well, that few other games of that time really did, was produce an atmosphere of sinister macabre. The fog flows all around James, changing in levels of density, creating an atmosphere of claustrophobia and uncertainty as we try to desperately discover where a particular sound is coming from. Camera angles are used in such a way to really underpin this feeling of claustrophobia. In many other games, such camera angles would be considered a detriment to core gameplay, but in Silent Hill 2, designers were given creative license to make the player feel a marauding sense of surveillance. Who by? We don't know. We just feel like we're being observed, and that's enough to uphold a sense of apprehension within us. Other key elements of the game give rise to fear when we initially see things that make us uncomfortable, but they're layered in such ambiguity that it makes us even more uncomfortable. An excellent example of this is when we first meet the infamous Pyramid Head, a formidable antagonist that's still hugely iconic to this day. He stands silently, doing nothing, except watching us from behind bars, observing us ominously. Even as a first-time player, you know we'll meet this executioner again, we just don't know when. Will it be whenever I open this door, leading to the place Pyramid Head was just standing? Much of what could be defined as eerie up to this point has had little to do with jump scares, but more to do with a combination of unsettling visual and audible subterfuge. Imemura Akihiro, producer of Silent Hill 2. In Silent Hill 2, fear could be defined as what you don't see makes you afraid. Akira Yamaoka has often been praised for his soundtrack, and rightly so, as it's one of the few soundtracks I've listened to that adds to the foreboding atmosphere and never subtracts from it. It never feels like a distraction. It completely complements what's on the screen, like Dario Argento's Suspiria or John Carpenter's The Thing. Take this simple, synthesized drone sound as he enters Silent Hill for the first time. Used sparingly throughout, but always at the right time, Silent Hill leans heavily into sound design to add an extra layer of ambiguity as you traverse your way through dimly lit lanes, damp corridors, or a disturbing, abandoned prison. Here's 3 examples that I find particularly unnerving when I last played Silent Hill 2. Number 1. Walking into Silent Hill. Number 2. Abandoned prison. Number 3. The prison gallows. And I haven't even mentioned the radio yet, an ingenious way in which we can get a heads up to the activity that surrounds James. Long, uncomfortable bursts of static emit from an old radio you found, notifying you of the presence of unwanted activity, but in true Silent Hill fashion, never specifically telling you where exactly from. Silence is also a sound. Akira Yamamoto, sound designer. It's been theorized over the years that Silent Hill 2 took inspiration from various sources. Takayoshi Sato, CGI director, himself referencing Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, though he doesn't delve into why this is the case, and gamers have struggled to see the connection with the classic 1866 Russian novel. Perhaps the connection is no more than Raskolnikov's journey, the main character of Crime and Punishment, and his descent into madness. Delirium at times, as he tries to hide the fact that he is indeed a murderer, entirely riddled with guilt, much in the same way James is riddled with guilt for the death of his wife, Mary. Unless Sato himself goes into more detail specifically on this, we'll simply only be able to theorize. Perhaps more obvious connections come from the silver screen, and perhaps none more obvious than the 1990 film Jacob's Ladder. Viscerally scary scenes and depictions of demented hallucinations. This is the telling of a man's psychological struggle on returning from the Vietnam War, isolated, with people to talk to but no one to understand. Both characters go through a journey of despair with seemingly no respite other than to confront their issues head on. The team also suggested that Blue Velvet was a particularly big inspiration, which seems more obvious when we watch these 2 scenes side by side. Outside of the film world, Masahiro Ito, lead artist on Silent Hill 2, took inspiration directly from artists such as Francis Bacon, who was notorious for creating surreal depictions of humans combined with unsettling imagery. In a recent tweet, Ito went on to say that he can't believe the Pyramid Head is still as popular today as it was in 2001. By the time Silent Hill 2 was released, there had already been 3 major Resident Evil titles, and it's no secret that Konami wanted Silent Hill to best Capcom's efforts. In many ways, they did, but never in terms of sales or the amount of revenue generated. I'm in no way dismissing Resident Evil's success. They're excellent games in their own right. Silent Hill was more complex, dark, and touched upon themes that Resident Evil stayed away from. While Silent Hill took influence from Jacob's Ladder, Resident Evil took influence from classic zombie movies like Dawn of the Dead. Silent Hill, Silent Hill 2, Silent Hill 3 and Silent Hill 4 The Room went on to sell a combined total of 5.3 million copies worldwide. Resident Evil 2, however, on its own sold 4.96 million copies worldwide. Unfortunately, regardless of how well received the game is by the media or by a number of fans, it simply comes down to how much revenue these titles can bring in. Some would argue that the Silent Hill games were a victim of a lack of marketing from Konami and sending the series off to its death when they outsourced to other developers rather than letting Team Silent continue their excellent work. Even with huge names like Hideo Kojima, Guillermo del Toro and Norman Reedus on board for PT, it wasn't enough, with Konami cancelling the title to focus their efforts elsewhere. With game budgets continuously becoming inflated, and the risk of shifting fewer units always being a concern, publishers have mostly reverted to a formulaic approach because it's risk adverse. This isn't just related to the gaming industry, with more experimental and thought-provoking films or pieces of music being released under smaller budgets, under lesser known record labels or distributors. However, not all is lost, and as long as game design and development continues to be as accessible as it is now, smaller individuals or independent teams will carry forward the torch of complex horror that places the human condition at the front and centre. I consider Silent Hill 2 art, a masterpiece, and a product of having the right team at the right time. And to me, it's unlikely that we will ever see anything of this quality again. The narrative truly transcends its video game medium to depict a series of characters in deep mental struggle. The narrative moves forward at a pace which can only be described as slow, which ensures the player must endure the hellish world. Groundbreaking in its approach, this was certainly the first game that I played that tackled these themes and was strictly created to tender to more mature audiences. For now, let's enjoy Silent Hill 2 for what it is, a classic slice of survival horror, and consider ourselves lucky that it came together at all.